What did you guys do on March 15th when they announced the confinement that would start that night? What did you do that day or that night to prepare for what was coming? What action did you take? That day, I saw long lines at the petrol stations, and so I assumed and interpreted from those signs that there was going to be a run on gas and that I needed to fill up both my cars. And so I quickly hurried to the petrol stations and filled up my cars so that over the next 2 months, I could go nowhere, and I didn't use any of that gas. But I also called all of my friends. Sorry if I didn't call you, but I called several people, and I said, the end is near, fill your cars. I said there's a few gas stations here or there that don't have long lines. You need to get over there and fill up your cars because we don't know what's going to happen. The end is near, get some gas. This is the message that I proclaimed when I heard the news that the confinement was going to be starting. I'm also kind of wondering, because we know the numbers are rising in France and confinements are being installed in various places, regulations are increasing. Well, what are you going to do this time if they announce a confinement is going to happen? Tonight, perhaps. Now, they haven't announced that, but what would you do today if they said midnight tonight, we're going back on lockdown, quarantine is starting again tonight? What would you do differently? I can tell you, I would go immediately and get a fresh haircut. That would be my plan. I don't know about you guys. I wouldn't go and fill up my car. I would live differently. You see, knowing times and dates often have an impact on our choices and our behavior. Knowing the times and dates of coming events, they often have an impact on our choices. We have, sometimes though, when we know that that date or that event is a long way off, it also causes us to delay some of those changes, to put off some of those choices and actions until later because we know we have time. And so we slip into a sort of lethargy or passivity because we know it's a long way off. Well, today's passage really challenges that perspective. We're looking at all of chapter 13 today. It's all one unit. We've got to go quickly through it. And there's a lot of detail in there, a lot of controversy, too, about the interpretation of this passage. But we're going to really try to just focus on the main point. I don't think we'll get lost on that. It's a discussion concerning the timing of future catastrophic events. It's looking into the future. And Jesus, he's going to offer us 5 key perspectives that are necessary for faithfulness in this present age and at the end of this age. 5 key principles for faithfulness in this present age and at the end of this age. Let's begin reading our text, chapter 13. We're going to look, first of all, at verses 1 to 13. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginnings of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you were to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. In the first paragraph, the disciples, they marveled at the wonderful and beautiful stones and structures of the Temple Mount. You see, Herod the Great, who ruled before Jesus' birth, he launched huge and amazing building programs throughout Israel, and his crowning achievement was the Temple Mount. Not just the temple itself, but the entire structure that it stood on. He extended it to where many football fields would fit on the surface of that area. And it was, I think, 13 stories tall. I can't remember exactly, but it was an amazing structure. And in the construction of that structure, there were enormous stones, many meters long and wide, impossible to move, yet they were able to put them in place to build this structure. And so naturally, it was an amazing sight to this original audience, these men who were walking around and seeing it in its prime. Now, if you go to Israel today and you see it, the temple's not there. The Temple Mount, the structure itself, still remains, and you will still marvel at the sheer size and magnificence of this structure, even though it's still in ruin. It is an amazing thing. But this creates an opportunity for Jesus to announce its coming destruction. You see, Jesus has already used a withered fig tree as an image of the spiritual condition of this house, of the spiritual state within. It was beautiful on the outside, but spiritually it was a wreck on the inside. And the issue was lack of faith and genuine worship. So therefore, he announces the temple's eventual destruction. Now, this announcement, it naturally provokes the disciples to question when. When will this be? That's a natural question. But what you do with the answer is the critical issue. And what the disciples are going to do with it, that's the issue. Once you know the time, once you know the date, when these things are going to happen, will you simply seek to be faithful at that time, or will you be faithful all of the time leading up to it? Will you be faithful at that time, or will you be faithful all the time, is the question. Put another way, will you be faithful in the waiting? And so first, in the first half of our passage, we're seeing a call to faithfulness in the present age, in the near future. In the waiting, but also while being confronted by various trials and threats to faithfulness. Jesus uses this question to call his disciples, and us included as his disciples today, to faithfulness in the present age, especially in threats to faithfulness. The issue here, and this is a key word, is watchfulness. Watchfulness is introduced with the phrase in verse 5, see that no one leads you astray. Be watchful that no one leads you astray. And next he outlines various threats to faithfulness that might cause the disciple to be deceived or to go astray, or possibly to be so troubled, so just thrown by these circumstances that they throw in the towel and they quit and they fall away. Maybe thinking that God isn't in control. Maybe doubting that his plan is working out. Well, he says, first of all, the first threat, that false messiahs will arise, claiming to be a new iteration of Jesus, a new version, his return. This has, of course, happened throughout the centuries, and many false messiahs have led many astray. They may not have called themselves Jesus, although some have. but many have risen to prominence to offer salvation in their name. Many false messiahs have arisen and led many astray. He also points to geopolitical chaos, wars and rumors of wars, natural disasters, earthquakes, and famines, plus other horrible but inevitable events which must take place. These types of events, whether they be wars that come close to home or things like earthquakes and tsunamis that seem in our day, maybe because of our access to news and globalized communication, seem to happen with greater and greater frequency, or even a global pandemic. They always tend to whip us up into a frenzy of speculation about what's really going on. Is this the end? But pay attention, disciple. His admonition to us here is not to be alarmed, not to be troubled by these things. Don't worry, don't be deceived. He says the end is not yet. This is the message. The end is not yet. You don't see many people standing on street corners with the sandwich boards on, reading, "The end is not yet." No, it's much more provocative to say the end is near, the end is nigh. I think maybe we should go out in the street saying the end is not yet about these circumstances. Actually, this is a message mostly for believers who might be troubled and might be discouraged in their faith. The message, the end of near, comes at the end of our passage. No, he says this is just the beginning, and these things must take place. It's just the beginning, and they must take place. See, they do fit within God's sovereignty and in God's plan. That's the first part of that. And this is just the beginning, he says. These things aren't easy. It's painful, as birth pains always are. I don't know from personal experience, but I've heard that they are quite painful. But it's just the beginning of what may come. So go back home and labor on a bit more. That's not a very pleasant message. You see, that actually was the message that Carmi and I received when Owen came along, our first child. We didn't know what to expect, and she woke up in the middle of the night with birth pains. I don't even remember if she woke me up. She probably did, and I rolled over and went back to sleep. She labored on a bit more at the house, and then early in the morning, we packed up and we went and saw the midwives. And the midwives said, "Honey, you can probably go on home and labor on a little bit more. It's still a long way off." And so we went back home, and for many more hours, labored at home. Eventually, it seemed like the time was right, and we went. And then many hours later, we had Owen. But the message from that midwife was, go on home, labor on. The end is not yet. These are just the beginnings of the birth pains. So, what do we do then? How do we respond when we are confronted by all this chaos in the world, by a global pandemic and all the other stuff that's happening? And so the idea here, the way that we need to respond in the chaos of this world, that makes us question if this is the end or possibly makes us want to quit. The key is watchfulness. Be on your guard, verse 9 says. Literally, see to yourselves, which is the idea of walking carefully, self-examination, searching your heart to see if it is being deceived or drawn away by these circumstances, by these threats. It is being vigilant about one's spiritual condition. And just as an application, I think this is best done in community with others who you're giving permission to speak into your life, to ask you tough questions. Because often we lack self-awareness and the ability to really search out our hearts. It's often easy for us to comfort ourselves with the thought that these possibilities are really far removed from us, because they are often, until it's not, until it's a global pandemic touching us. We reassure ourselves that at least it's peaceful where I am, at least the epidemic is in Asia and not coming to the West. But then Jesus brings it home in this next paragraph. He uses the pronoun you and addresses issues that confront his disciples and potentially us as we walk faithfully with him. The paragraph presents 2 rounds of adversity. It's kind of a cycle. 2 rounds and then of something bad, and then a promise of a positive outcome. So as you read through that paragraph, if you're writing in the margin, you can write bad, bad, good. Bad, bad, good. That's kind of the flow of that paragraph. Well, the first round, he says, you, not they, but you, will be arrested, beaten, and put on trial before the highest authorities in the land. And obviously this brings to mind Jesus' own suffering, that these things are going to unfold in his life in this same week. But where's the good news? The positive outcome that he points to is that there is purpose in it. There is purpose. The purpose being that they will have the opportunity to bear witness, to testify of who Jesus is, of his supremacy, of value in their lives. And I think we all can acknowledge by seeing the testimony of the lives who have lived this, that nothing testifies louder than someone who is staying faithful in hardship. The idea here is that faithfulness can bring trouble, but trouble also brings in a platform to proclaim his name. When you reject the trouble, you also lose the opportunity to bear witness in the midst of it. Now, verse 10 gives us the scope and purpose, the scope of this purpose. God's greater purpose is global in scale. And it is advanced by the faithfulness of God's people, who will be supernaturally empowered for this witness by the Holy Spirit. In the moment where they will confess allegiance to Christ, when their life hangs in the balance, the Spirit will speak through them, and the Spirit will speak through us. I think you can extend this to circumstances that are as severe as what he's portraying here, or less severe, perhaps, where your life is not in the balance. Maybe your reputation is what hangs in the balance, or just your fear of fellow man, your fear of the person that's standing in front of you. The Spirit will give you what to say. Trust and lean on the Spirit in that moment. That is the assurance. It is the promise of provision. Provision. You're not on your own. It doesn't depend solely on you. This should be an encouragement to each of us when we consider our responsibility and our call to be a witness in this age. It should encourage us when we are to be willing to put ourselves out there, even where trouble may come as a result. And then round 2, verses 12 to 13, the trouble will not be limited to courtrooms and throne rooms, but will also come into your living room, because the trouble may touch your family as well. And we saw that play out in the first century, and it does play out today. Maybe not so much in our area, but I know some of you, I know your testimonies. I know that there has been family discord and separation as a result of the gospel. And that's what he's talking about here. Families will turn on each other. Society even will turn on you, and you will be hated by all. However, there is a positive outcome, and it's a promise. A promise that those who endure to the end will be saved. Acceptance in your family and in society may be lost, but eternal acceptance before God is maintained and outweighs all of these. It is looking at our salvation as the promise. Now, I'm sure you've all seen, and Forgive me to my British brothers and sisters here. You've seen the posters from the beginning of World War II, keep calm and carry on. I didn't realize that those were mostly lost until the year 2000 when they were rediscovered and then became popular in printed media and social media and then repurposed and words were changed around a lot. Well, these keep calm and carry on posters were printed up as a campaign in 1939 in England. They were meant to motivate the British public with that Victorian cultural idea, that British stiff upper lip. Forgive me as I'm speaking about your culture. This idea that we can get through it because that's just the British way. Am I way off? But that Victorian ideal of that stiff upper lip, that willing yourself through what's coming. I bring that up because that is not at all what's going on here in our text. It doesn't come from within, but it comes from these assurances that Jesus offers us. And to review them, the first was the reassurance of purpose in the midst of those troubles and trials. That we will be witnesses and that we are participating in the global proclamation of the gospel. And that in this task, there will be provision. Provision of God's very presence that empowers us to be witnesses through His Spirit. And finally, there's the assurance of a promise. The promise of everlasting life. Purpose, provision, and promise. That would go nicely on a poster. And then the next section, there's a hinge with this but at the beginning of verse 14. And actually, we're going to see two big buts in this passage. That was for the kids. Call to faithfulness at the end of this age. That's what the second half of our passage is looking at. Verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all these things beforehand. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. So we said verse 14 starts with a big but. This is a transition from things that will be encountered by Jesus' audience in the near future or at any time, even in our lives, things which are not signs of the end, to a discussion of things which immediately precede the end, the true signs. So first, false signs, ignore these, is not the end, to the true sign. Jesus inserts this here because he has just called his disciples to faithfulness, to stand firm, stay planted, be a witness. But now he's saying, in the face of this, flee. Get out of there. Get out of Dodge. Now, That's a pretty big difference in response. This passage has caused a lot of debate over its interpretation, and it's always that way with unfulfilled prophecy, especially one that is intentionally, I think, non-specific. Again, Jesus isn't trying to make us faithful by forecast. He's not trying to give us a detailed roadmap that we need to follow, but it's going to take faith. He gives us some details to recognize the end, but it still requires faith in the mystery and in the uncertainty. With all that being said, here's a bit where I land on this passage. The abomination of desolation, I think it seems to point to a human figure. You can see that in the grammar of the passage, a neuter construction for the abomination, a masculine construction for standing in that participle. I think it points to a human figure who will enter the temple in such a way that he both desecrates it in an unholy way, but also renders it desolate and ruins it. This passage is recalling for us prophecies from Daniel chapter 9, 11, and 12, but it's also bringing to mind what took place in the year 168 BC when Antiochus IV Epiphanes came in, erected an altar to Zeus in the place of the altar in the temple, and sacrificed a pig on it. You know your Old Testament. You know how abhorrent that idea is. Well, there is a prophecy in Daniel and a near fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes. There is an ultimate fulfillment still to come at the end of the age, and that is what Jesus is pointing to. It is often this way with prophecy in the Bible. There is often an immediate, but then an ultimate fulfillment. Jesus is pointing to the future, saying that this prediction in Daniel and this prefigurement in the 2nd century, that it will one day reach its ultimate fulfillment in an unmistakable way and this is how you need to respond. Now, attempt has been made to say that this prophecy from Jesus' lips was fulfilled by various people throughout the 1st century, and maybe the two most likely would be Caligula and around the year 40 A.D., he wanted to install statues around Jerusalem and in the temple, although he did not succeed. Or Titus's overthrowing of Jerusalem and the eventual destruction of the temple. He entered the temple in 70 A.D. Now, I personally think that this figure is the same, this abomination of desolation is the same person that you will read about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The man of lawlessness who, quote, takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Now, again, while there may be immediate fulfillments, even in 70 A.D. at the destruction of Jerusalem with Titus, it also seems that the ultimate fulfillment of this event remains in the future. It's not tightly or fully fulfilled with Titus, or even with Antiochus. What is most important here, all debates aside, what is most important here is the function of what Jesus is saying here. We need to catch Jesus' main point and not get caught up in the speculation. His agenda is to prescribe a different kind of response to this particular sign. The proper response at this time, instead of standing firm, will be to flee. And he goes through great detail to encourage that it should be done in a hurry, that it should be done recognizing, understanding the unique severity of it, that it's going to be really bad, like worse than ever, and nothing will ever compare to it in the future. And to remember that God is still in control despite the chaos. Meanwhile, to be aware of false Christs, false prophets, who would take advantage of those chaotic times to gather more followers. Now, that paragraph concludes with another call to watchfulness. Again, that's the key theme of today's passage, watchfulness. because his primary concern is that the elect, the people of God, and this is where we can apply it to our lives today in this present age, would remain faithful even in the craziest of times. Even at the end of times, when things really get bad, we walk with watchfulness to maintain faithfulness in those crazy times. And here's the second big but of today's passage, and that is this comparison, this contrast between the abomination of desolation on the one hand and the coming of the Son of Man on the other. The abomination of desolation versus the Son of Man. This truly is the end of the age. We see in this paragraph, it's unmistakable that this is the end of the age. We have not seen these kinds of cataclysmic events. The kinds of signs outlined in this part of our passage, they are cosmic in nature. The sun and the moon and the stars are affected. They represent a cosmic upheaval which comes after the Great Tribulation and before the coming of the Son of Man. And he is said to come in the clouds with great power and glory, which we've already talked about this in our study of Mark, corresponds to Daniel 7. And this image, this vision of the coming of the Son of Man, it announces to us, it tells us that he is divine. He is coming as God. And if we look closely at verse 27, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. It offers us the hope that we need to face all this chaos. He is coming for us. And the us will be made up of you and I and people from all nations, from the ends of the earth. That's amazing and encouraging news. We pay close attention to this verse because it proclaims to us that global proclamation of the gospel that he said we need to be about in this present age is fulfilled at the end of the age. And so the elect that he gathers in includes all of us and includes people from all nations. And that is the assurance that the mission will be accomplished. Will be, that we're still in it now. So what now? How do we live in light of the promise of his coming? Do we just sit back and wait? Do we build underground bunkers and ride out the storm? Do we need to be heralds of the coming chaos? Jesus has finally two parables for us to show us what perspectives we need to adopt for this age. Verse 28 to the end. From the fig tree. Now I got to pick out my prop. It's very convenient that we have a fig tree right over here. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. I never really fully appreciated this passage until I moved to France and there were fig trees everywhere. And I started to mark the calendar by fig trees that were all around me and seeing their progress and recognizing at the end of summer, I'm going to get some of the most amazing figs I've ever had. In fact, I didn't even like figs until I moved to France. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the end is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day, second parable, that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. These two parables teach us about the imminency of his return. The imminency. There's lots of words that sound that way, and I always have a hard time remembering how to spell this one. But the doctrine of imminency, I-M-M-I-N-E-N-C. I-M-M-I. So just remember, I-M-M-I is how you pronounce or spell this one. The idea is that his return is imminent, is the idea that from our vantage point, his return is near. It's close. It's right around the corner, and therefore we live according to that principle. I remember imminency and how it's spelled by I'm. It concerns me. In minute, in any minute, he's going to come. The parable of the fig tree is instructive because the fig tree is a sign that summer is near. The harvest is coming. The harvest comes. Are you ready? When he says this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place, another passage with a lot of discussion about what that means. This could either mean the generation who witnesses these final signs will not pass away until they all take place, meaning they all take place in a tight window of time. Or perhaps, and I think this is where I land on this, that this generation is being used in the way that it's been used throughout Mark to refer to the people of Israel, to refer to the Jews. That might be a minority position, but I think it may refer to simply that the Jews will not pass out of existence until all these things take place, that God still has a plan for the people of Israel. And I think throughout the centuries we would have thought that that was wrong until this past century when the nation was reconstituted. So, either way, the birth pains, the imminency of his return, it gives us a reason to live, and catch this, with a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency about how we live. We need to be about accomplishing the mission because Jesus is at the same time regarding all the circumstances. The end is not yet, but at the same time he's saying the end is near. The doctrine of imminency. The end is near. The time is now to participate in his mission, and the time is now to respond appropriately and to come to him if you don't know him. The parable of the master, the second parable, he goes on a journey and it teaches us about the unpredictability of his return. Not just the nearness of it, but the unpredictability of it. He's coming at any moment. And so what will our focus be when he returns? This encourages us to have a value for attentiveness, not living with a spiritual indifference, thinking that this day doesn't matter. In this one paragraph, he uses 3 different words for watchfulness. Be on guard, keep awake. And then at the end of the passage, that final stay awake is a different word, and it kind of has the idea of being vigilant, being alert. Is this how you live your spiritual life? Is this how you walk it out? With this kind of attentiveness, this seriousness about the importance of this age and this very day. Do you live with this kind of responsibility to the Master? These parables are meant to motivate us to keep from falling asleep at the wheel in our spiritual lives, to not neglect being watchful, examining our hearts to see if we are being led astray, to evaluate our priorities, to see if we are participating in his mission of proclaiming the gospel. And really, this isn't meant to be a guilt trip, to assume that you're not participating and not taking it seriously and to bring about a sense of condemnation in your heart. No, it is a call to recognize simply the importance of this time and to take seriously how we live in this life. And so to conclude, I want to review these 5 perspectives that we are to adopt about this living in this present age. The first is that he has given us a purpose, that our trouble creates opportunities to witness about who Jesus is Possibly before governors and kings, maybe not, but at least to those who are around you and are watching to see how you respond to the chaos in this world. He's given you purpose. There is purpose in your pain. And secondly, provision of his power and presence. Provision. He will empower you through his Spirit to fulfill this purpose. Thirdly is that promise that we have a sure promise of his return and our eventual salvation, which enables us to live fearlessly and faithfully no matter the circumstances, remembering, like he announced about the coming of the Son of Man, he's coming back for his own. He's coming back for us. And the fourth and fifth perspectives from the parables, they both relate to the imminency of his return. We live with a sense of urgency because his coming is near, and we live with a watchfulness because his return is unpredictable. So I would encourage you to begin to walk with these five perspectives: purpose, provision, promise, and then a sense of urgency and watchfulness because his coming is near and unpredictable. Let's pray. Father, there's a lot of meat in this passage. It's very thick, a lot to process. But Lord, you have used it. You have looked into the end of times, and you have revealed to us how we ought to live in this present age. And Lord, I know and I confess that there are days where I would rather binge on Netflix than consider how to live seriously in this time. And so, Lord, I thank you, first of all, for the grace you give me to know what my purpose is and to receive an assurance that you do not despise me because of my inattentiveness to that purpose, but you desire to empower me to be a witness in this age, to take seriously the opportunity that lies before me to bear witness to your name. Lord, I pray also that any of those who are with us or seeing this online that don't know you and think that there is still time to wait and to be unconcerned about who you are and the fact that it is only through you that we will receive that salvation, that they would turn to you today, recognizing that you may come at any moment. And so now is the appropriate time to receive you. Lord, I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.